In this section, we'll talk about manipulating reinforcers to reduce problem behavior. We'll cover each of these differential reinforcement procedures one at a time. The first one, differential reinforcement of other behavior, and is sometimes called differential reinforcement of omission. If it helps you to use the word omission instead of other, I would say use that. But most people are familiar with what DRO is. The next one we'll talk about is differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior, which is closely related to differential reinforcement of alternative behavior. Those two are the same intervention except for the way in which the appropriate behavior is selected. With DRI, you're picking a behavior that's incompatible with the problem behavior. In other words, if you're doing this behavior, you can't possibly be doing the problem behavior at the same time. With DRA, you're choosing a behavior that is a functional alternative to the problem behavior. And then finally, DRL is differential reinforcement of low rates. This is using reinforcement to reinforce a student for engaging in lower levels of a behavior. You only use this intervention when it's a behavior that is a problem because it's happening too frequently. It's not a serious problem behavior, it just happens too much, and a lot of behaviors fit that criteria. With DRO, or differential reinforcement of other behavior, what you're doing is you're reinforcing the student for going a period of time and not engaging in a problem behavior. In other words, it's anything except the target behavior. And you qualify that a little. You don't want to reinforce the student if he or she's doing some other problem behavior either. There are two forms of it. You start out with whole interval DRO. And if you think about whole interval recording, what you're doing is you're reinforcing the student for going an entire interval or period of time without engaging in a problem behavior. Later on, you switch to something called momentary DRO, and that's similar to momentary time sampling. The question is the person engaging in this problem behavior at a specific instance in time? And you do this as part of the fading procedure for DRO. In order to implement DRO, you have to do several things. First of all, you have to find out the inter-response interval. That's the average amount of time between instances of inappropriate behavior. So let's say that you've got a kid who engages in a problem behavior 6 times in 1 hour. You determine the inter-response interval by taking the amount of time, in this case 60 minutes, dividing by the number of behaviors. So if you divide 60 by 6, you've got on average every 10 minutes this behavior occurs. You do that for several days. So if you get 6 times in an hour, and the next day it's 12 times in an hour, that would turn out to be 5 minutes. So you get another day that may be 8 minutes. So each day you take the amount of time, you divide it by the number of behaviors that occurred, and then you average those together, and that'll give you the average amount of time between occurrences of behavior. Once you get this, you do what is called first stage of DRO. You set up reinforcement intervals that are a little bit less than the inter-response interval. For example, if the behavior happens on average, let's say 3.5 minutes, every 3.5 minutes, you would set up your initial DRO interval at 3 minutes. So it's either going to be equal to or a little bit less than the inter-response time. And the reason you do this is reinforcement programs only work if the student is initially successful. So the student's got to actually earn the reinforcer for going a period of time and not engaging in the problem behavior. The way that you make that happen is you make that DRO interval short enough that the student is going to earn the reinforcer about 80% of the time. So you implement this intervention, reinforcing the student. You have to use some kind of timer with this. You can either use a clock, or you can use an iPod Touch, or just a kitchen timer that costs $2. And you reinforce the student on this schedule. Some kind of visual feedback usually helps too. I usually start out something that I can eventually turn into a self-monitoring program. Okay, once the student is successful, so you have a criteria for how often, and so let's say that if the student earns the reinforcer for 2 days in a row, let's say I'm only implementing this for 1 hour a day, and that's how you should start out these kinds of programs. Then stage 2 DRO is I'm going to gradually lengthen this reinforcement interval. So I'm going to decide, okay, every time this student earns the reinforcer 2 days in a row, I'm going to increase this interval by 30 seconds. If it was, let's say the behavior was happening once every 5 minutes, I might increase the interval by a minute. Sort of do it proportionally to the size interval you're using. So here's an example. Let's say that we have a behavior that's happening 5 times in 10 minutes. The rate of this behavior is 0.5 per minute, because if we take the number of times behavior occurs and divided it by time, that gives us the rate. However, if we want inter-response interval, we do the inverse of that. We take the time and divide it by the number of behaviors. So here we got one behavior happening every 2 minutes. If I want to make the initial reinforcement interval shorter, I'm going to go down to 1 minute. So I'm going to reinforce this student every minute that he or she has not engaged in a problem behavior. This works better if you have some kind of token system, because it's hard to deliver a reinforcer every minute. What you need to know: DRO does not teach students what to do. If you use this as an intervention, you have to have some procedure for teaching appropriate behavior at the same time. So it's not skill building. It doesn't teach alternative behaviors. It can be effective if you've got behaviors that happen at really high rates to the point that it's hard to do anything else with a student. I've used DRO interventions just as a way to get the rate of that behavior down. It'll do that pretty quickly sometimes. Then I'll use the time I gain to teach some kind of alternative behavior and reinforce the student for doing something appropriate. Another thing you have to remember is you've got to plan what you're going to do if the problem behavior occurs. In other words, you need a backup procedure. You need something that you can do if the behavior becomes dangerous, or how are you going to handle it if the student gets reinforced for the problem behavior by something else. That's one of the things you have to look at with DRO. If the student's getting reinforced for engaging in the problem behavior, it's going to be less effective. So you have to eliminate any kind of reinforcement if you can. Also, the student, what we mean by the matching law, that's simply a statement that we're going to distribute our behavior over different behaviors that get reinforced. In other words, it goes along with the bootleg reinforcement idea. If the problem behaviors are getting reinforced, they're going to continue to occur, and that reinforcement might be more motivating than what you're giving the student with a DRO. These are just some examples. I'd like you to look at these and work through yourself. Now let's talk about the distinction between DRI and DRA. Well, both of them are schedules of reinforcement, and they're ways of increasing appropriate behavior. With DRI, you want to pick a behavior that you're going to increase that is physically incompatible with a problem behavior. This is really useful if it's your behavior that you're concerned with is something like on-task behavior, or if the problem is that the kid is off-task a lot. It makes more sense to increase on-task behavior. If you have a good operational definition of on-task behavior and a good operational definition of off-task behavior, your definition should make it so that it's not possible for a student to be on task and off task at the same time. I mean, think about it. It doesn't really make any sense for a kid to be on task and off task at the same time. And you need to fix your definition so that it's going to work that way. So if you set up a reinforcement system for increasing a student for being on task, and you increase the percentage of time the student is on task, then off-task behavior will automatically decrease proportionally. So, one is the inverse of the other. This works for things like out of seat as well. If you reinforce the kid for being in seat, you're going to see out of seat behavior decrease. You can use it for things like positive and negative interactions with peers. So you're increasing positive interactions, and then you'll see negative interactions decrease. Most of the time when I've used DRI, it's almost always been with something like on-task behavior or in-seat behavior. It works really well with those kinds of behaviors. DRA, or differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, is something that I actually use more. With DRA, you're picking an appropriate behavior that is not necessarily physically incompatible with the problem behavior. In other words, it would be possible for the student to do them both at the same time. However, you're picking a behavior that you believe, based on your functional behavior assessment, is going to serve the same purpose or function as the problem behavior. In other words, it results in the same consequence. So an example might be that you teach a student communication skill rather than hitting himself. In the article by Conroy that you read, they did a functional behavior assessment of a 4-year-old boy with autism, and they determined that the function of his tantrum behavior was to get access to tangible objects and toys. They taught an alternative behavior of using a picture to request an object. When they did that, they saw tantrums decrease proportionally. That's a good example of a DRA. They're both useful, but you use them in different situations.